Hello and welcome to the Fulton Public Library's first Hand Embroidery 101 video. My name is Caroline Chatterton and I started these classes in the library a couple months ago and wanted to continue them virtually while we're temporarily closed. So let's get started. Here are the things that you're going to need to complete your very first embroidery project. So I've already got the first one here, an embroidery hoop. There are many sizes and materials that are easily accessible from, you can get them from your local craft store or even Walmart, Amazon. This one that I'm using today is about 9.5 inches in diameter, and it's made of bamboo. That's pretty typical. Next, you'll need some fabric. I would suggest, if this is your first time, practicing on scraps of fabric or buying remnants from the craft store or even Walmart. Fabric remnants are sections of fabric that are left over from runs of fabric at productions facilities, as well as portions of fabric scraps that are left over after a project is complete. They can range in size from a couple of inches all the way through to sections that are yards long. Often these fabric pieces are either discarded or sold at a deep discount, and they can be used for a number of creative projects, sort of like this one. You'll need embroidery floss. I'm going to use white today because I think it'll stand out on my pink fabric. A hand sewing needle or an embroidery needle. Scissors. And needle threader. This one is optional, but if you're going to be using multiple strands of your embroidery floss, then you're going to want a needle threader. Most embroidery floss skeins are made up of 6 strands, and so depending on the pattern, it'll ask you to use different amounts of strands. So I find that the more strands you have, the harder it is to thread with just your fingers. I'm going to be using 6 strands today because I really want these stitches to stand out. All right, so let's talk about getting your embroidery hoop set up. The first thing you want to actually do is prepare your fabric. So you can see, well, fuzz there, you can see that I have actually drawn on some lines for reference. We're actually going to be following these lines during our practice. We're going to be stitching right along them so that we can just keep track of where we are and make sure it's nice and straight. I've tried to iron the fabric. You can see that some creases are still left in there, but for practice sake, it's not a big deal, and they'll probably come out in the wash. Now, you want to take your hoop, unscrew the outer hoop, and separate them. Okay, set the outer hoop aside and put your inner hoop in your workspace. And then we're going to take the fabric and we're going to lay it on top of our inner hoop. I'm trying to make sure that the border lines that I drew, my guidelines, are nice and even. Okay, then you take your outer hoop and you lay it on top of your inner hoop. We want the fabric to be nice and taut because it makes it easier to stitch on. Okay, and then we're going to tighten the screw if I can. There we go. And there, you're all set. Next, you're going to want to cut your desired length of embroidery floss. I have no magic formula for how much you should really be cutting. I'm usually playing embroidery floss chicken and hoping that I've cut enough for it to last what I'm trying to work on. But you can always tie it off and rethread your needle if you run out. That's not a big deal. So, like I said, I'm using all 6 strands, so I'm going to be using my needle threader. And if you haven't used one of these before, all you do is take the wire part, insert it into the eye of the needle, Then take the thread or the floss, put it into there, and pull it through the eye. And there we have it. All right, and then we want to tie off the end of our embroidery floss here so that we have a nice little knot, and we're good to go. So we're going to start with a running stitch. A running stitch is a simple needlework stitch. It's a real basic one that consists of a line of small even stitches that run in and out of the cloth without overlapping. So you'll notice that as you're stitching this, that the stitches have spaces in between them. They aren't very close together. So one challenge of this stitch is making sure that they all look even. You're going to start from behind the fabric and pull it through. And then depending on the size of the stitches you want, you're going to put it back in and pull back through. And you're just going to repeat this. So now at this point you have finished your running stitch. You can see mine is not perfect, it's a little bit uneven, but that's alright, we're just practicing. And you can always take stitches out and redo them if you'd like, there's no shame in that, I do it all the time. So now that we've finished, I just like to make a knot by pulling it through one of my last stitches. And pulling it tight. And then take our scissors and trim the end. And there is the running stitch. Here's an example of how I use the running stitch in one of my most recent projects. All of the little lines connecting the stars here, that is the running stitch. That's how you might use it in a project. It could also be used as an outline or just, you know, a quick fix for or a repair job. Today's video, we are actually going to be doing 2 stitches. The running stitch is a little bit of a review for those that had come to my classes previously, so I wanted to do something new for those people as well. So the next stitch that we're going to use is a pretty important one. It's called the back stitch. It's actually one of the strongest stitches you can do by hand. Due to its back and forth motion and the ability to get really small, close stitches, the back stitch is actually the strongest stitch you can use when you don't have a sewing machine. So, like before, we're going to come up from behind and pull the needle through. Alright, we're going to just start just like the running stitch, okay? And pull it back through the fabric. Now, again like the running stitch, we're going to come back up an even amount away from our first stitch. The distance of the stitches depends on you, but for the best results you want to make the stitch as small as you can. So the next part, we're going to actually take our needle and put it through our first stitch where we went back down. You're putting it through that same hole. See how tight and neat that is compared to the running stitch that has spaces in between the stitches? And so we're just going to repeat like this, coming back up through, trying to stay as even as possible. And we're going back down through the same hole as the last stitch. So coming back, up. And you can see right away how much tighter and how much neater the back stitch is compared to the running stitch. Going to continue this all the way to the end of your line. Okay, so here we are coming to the end of our practice run here, and just as a review, we're going to pull the thread up from behind. And we're going to take a small back stitch in the fabric, inserting the needle in the same place you started. And at the end here, you should have this really tight, neat line of back stitches. Oh, I kind of messed that one up there. See how I didn't quite go into the stitch? I went a little bit underneath it. And so I would probably pull that stitch out, rethread my needle, and then put it in the right spot. Now, you'll notice when you turn it over that the back stitch on the back side of the fabric looks like this kind of one continuous unbroken line of thread, and that's because you're continuing to, when you push the needle back through, it goes in between the thread of the last stitch. So you would tie that off. And there you have it. Your running stitch and your back stitch. Here's an example of a project where I used quite a bit of back stitch. There are several other stitches in here, but all of this, including the little smoke swirls, is all back stitch. So you can see how you can use it in a functional way and in a artistic way. So that's it for today for our very first Embroidery 101 techniques. We learned the running stitch and we learned the back stitch, in addition to just the basics of getting the right fabric and setting up your hoop. Stay tuned, I will be posting more videos next week.